Test. Hello? Okay, let's give this a try. How do I change the thumbnail? Alright, let's go ahead and do this. Okay, so this is the first ever airing of Otto's Toy Factory. So let's go ahead and begin. Otto's Toy Factory, Chapter 1, At My Bedroom Window. Have you ever had an imaginary friend? Someone you could play with when you were alone in your room. Someone whom you could share your innermost thoughts and secrets with. I did. His name was Otto, Otto the bear. Now, unlike most imaginary friends, existing only as harmless characters within the confines of their mind, mine was real, and mine turned my life into a living hell. I first met Otto when I was 7. My mother, father, and I lived in a small, low-income apartment in Placerville County, California. My parents were teetering on the edge of divorce, and I had absolutely no friends at school. My way of coping through the ordeal was by isolating myself in my room, doing homework or playing with my toys, all while quietly listening to my parents endlessly bicker down the hall. At first, it was just me, my schoolwork, and my imagination, my only escape from the real world. Eventually, those pleasures were no longer enough. After Dad moved out, I stopped doing my homework. I didn't play much either. Instead, I spent almost all my time in bed sleeping. As a result, my grades started slipping. When Mom saw my progress report, not only was she pissed, she grounded me until my grades got back up. To make sure I did my homework without any distraction, she stripped my bedroom of my toys, TV, VCR, anything and everything that was considered childhood entertainment. Among these included my most favorite toy of all, Bo, a stuffed snowy white rabbit with a cute triangle pink nose, big black button eyes, and wearing blue denim overalls with gold-colored clasps. I had him since I was crawling. The worst of all, however, was not that my mom took away all my toys, but the fact that she made me spend the entire day helping her. By the time we were finished, there was nothing left but the bare essentials. 4 dirty baby blue walls with pale reminders of my posters, a desk filled with paper and pencils, a simple dresser drawer filled with plain colored clothes, a perfectly made bed, and finally, my window, where my only view was the filthy alleyway outside. I was so angry with my mother. So angry to the point where we argued during dinner over my grades and Dad leaving us. An argument that ended with my mother giving me a few good swats to the ass and sending me to my room a sobbing, pouting mess. It was that very same night when I met him, Otto the bear. It was late January 1998. I remember because it was raining that night and raining hard. I was in bed. I finally calmed down just enough to sleep. A few hours later, I had this feeling in my dreams like something was watching me just outside of my bedroom window. I stirred awake and glanced at the alarm clock on my dresser. It was midnight. My attention turned to the window across from my bed. Like any 7-year-old, I half expected to see some evil phantom standing on the fire escape, gawking back at me with sick, twisted, psychotic eyes. There was nothing. We lived on the 5th story, so seeing nothing should not have surprised me. But something was still not right about the environment outside. At first, I laid in bed, watching the rainfall cascade in sheets from the dark clouds above, bouncing off the rails and streaming from the labyrinths of drenched clotheslines swaying gently in the breeze, counting the seconds between the bright flashes of light and the subtle cracks of thunder reverberating in the distance. Within minutes, the comforting sight of clothes and sounds of raindrops soothed me, almost to the point where I nearly fell back asleep, when I felt a sudden urge to go to the window. Well, not an urge, but more like an invitation. Like someone or something was encouraging me to get out of bed, but the option to do so was still mine. Looking back, I should have just pulled the covers over my head and faced the wall and gone right back to sleep. But instead, I made the stupidest decision of my life. Shifting the covers aside, I lifted my head off the pillow as my feet slunk their way out of bed and ever so gently applied themselves on the chilled, creaky wooden floor. I silently hoisted myself off of the mattress, and like a puppet on strings, I found myself wandering my way across the room until my body halted in front of the aperture. My confusion morphed into curiosity as I found myself watching for any signs of activity outside. At first, my foggy eyes, combined with the extreme weather, prevented me from seeing anything. But as my vision cleared, I proceeded to scan the alleyway below until I noticed something moving in the pocket of wet darkness. A big black shadow slipped into the safety of the space between the two buildings neighboring mine. Wiping the condensation off the glass, I could make out a vague image of it hugging the wall like a secret agent. He was there, in the shadows, a giant figure, not human, but a heavy-set bestial figure, standing upright like a human. It retreated into the safety of the shadows. Curious, I opened my window. Icy winter air flooded into my bedroom as I poked my head and shoulders outside the wooden frame. Frozen droplets of water fell from the level above, seeping into my collar and tangled hair. Standing on my tiptoes, I stretched my torso as far as I could while struggling to maintain my abdomen, keep my abdomen balanced on the ledge. I wanted to get the best view of the creature, over the rusted railing of the fire escape and through the rain. After another minute, the bestial silhouette peered over the corner of the opposing building and glanced back up at me. At least I think he was. There was an indication of his head moving, but his eyes did not glow. And he was quiet. So quiet that several late-night pedestrians walking by the alley hadn't noticed him lingering just feet away. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes. Then the beast lifted its right paw, tipped with 5 long, razor-sharp claws, and waved to me. Not knowing what to do, I waved back. My action prompted the creature to come out of its hiding place. While keeping its gaze on me, the beast stepped into the alley on 2 legs, again like a human, partially exposing itself to the dim light provided by the resting street lamps at either side of the alley. But the rain and overlaying darkness still distorted his figure. Despite the setback, I took the opportunity to get a better idea of its size based on something in the alley. A dumpster set adjacent to him. From what I remembered from the signs put on those dumpsters, the dumpster was about 6 feet high, and the animal was even taller. So maybe around 10 feet? He was heavy too. Not too morbidly obese, not like an obese human heavy, but his stomach was wide enough to give him that body shape of a giant stuffed plushie. Overwhelmed by fascination, I leaned further out of the frame to get a better look when I smelled something funny in the air. An unusual aroma, like a blend of wet dog and expired meat. I knew it was coming from him. Where else? The beast just stood there, watching me. The both of us were locked in a staring contest. Subconsciously, I craned my head to the side, and he did the same. I froze, stunned by what I just witnessed. It was like watching a mirror. The creature then set his head back upright as our gaze remained fixated on each other once more. As the monster watched on, a large limb behind him, I presumed was its tail, began lifting up and smacking the wet pavement, slapping water into the air provided by a small puddle. I discerned this behavior was the equivalent of a puppy wagging its tail in the presence of its new master. Just as I worked up the courage to say something, I heard the sound of a door opening from down the hall outside my room. It was my mother. I assumed she felt the cold breeze filtering from my room and had come in to check on me. I knew if she caught me out of bed at this hour, she would spank me until my ass was raw and throw out my belongings altogether. Her footsteps grew louder as I silently but hastily shut the window and tiptoed as fast as I could back to bed. Throwing the covers over me, I faced the wall just as Mom switched on the hallway light and turned the doorknob. A ray of light penetrated the looming darkness of my room and grew wider as the door opened with a squeal. The light cast her shadow onto the wall and brightened my eyelids, regardless of how tightly I kept them. Mom poked her head around the door. I could feel her eyes burning holes into the back of my skull, like Superman's laser vision through steel, waiting for any signs of movement. I wouldn't be surprised if she knew I was awake that night, because I forgot about how soaked my hair and neck had gotten from the pouring rain. I had the back of my head facing her, with water seeping into my pillow as well. I was certain at this point I was caught, though I still pretended to be asleep like any child. Though I guess the room was just dark enough, because she didn't say anything to me. She simply shut the door, turned off the hallway light, and went about halfway back to her room. I know because of how quickly her footsteps stopped. She was waiting out in the hallway, trying to see if she could catch me in the act. Naturally, I waited in bed for at least 30 or 40 minutes before she finally gave up and went back to bed herself. Then I waited another 10 minutes before certitude prompted me to get up and return to the window. I opened it once again to find nothing waiting for me in the alleyway. Thinking that I imagined the whole experience, I closed the window and went straight back to bed. The following morning, I was eating breakfast with my mom. We said nothing to one another. I considered telling her about my experience the previous night, but then decided not to. She wouldn't believe me, I thought to myself. She would just yell at me for making something up and punish me even more for confirming her suspicion. Instead, I focused on eating, with the smell of overcooked scrambled eggs and bacon being my only comfort in what I knew would be another long and treacherous school day. After an awkwardly silent meal, I brushed my teeth, packed my book bag, and followed my mom out to the car. Rain continued to pour from last night into the early morning hours. It was about a 20-minute drive to school, and just like breakfast time, we didn't breathe a word to each other, cluing me in on just how serious last night's argument was. Every morning, Mom and I would always sing songs or play I Spy. That was how it always was. Just me and my mom and our old navy blue 1981 Datsun. It had always been that way ever since I could talk. Instead of saying anything to her, I just stared out the car window, watching as apartments, stores, and restaurants passed us by. When we arrived, Mom pulled over at the front of the entrance of the campus. I looked outside as other kids leaped out of their cars, racing through the open gates to the waiting blacktop and playground to socialize with their friends. Probably talking about what video games were popular, trading Pokemon cards, or playing tag before the bell rang for class. I remember wishing I was one of those kids as I opened the door and placed my Digimon-themed sneakers on the wet pavement. Before stepping away from the car, I looked back to Mom. I remember the expression on her face through the rearview mirror. She looked like she was trying her hardest to hold back her tears. A woman broken, but determined. I tried to think of something to say to comfort her, or at least apologize for the previous night, but I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I squeaked the usual thing a 7-year-old boy would say. Bye, Mom. Mom lowered her head and gulped. Then, with a weakened, desolate voice, she said, Goodbye, sweetie. I love you. I could tell she was trying not to cry over our situation, remaining strong for my sake. Still, I sensed something was wrong, like something bad was going to happen. But instead, I weakly shook the feeling off and stepped away from the car. Closing the door behind me, I watched as she sped off, merging her vehicle with traffic, and vanished amongst the misty chaos. That feeling I had with Mom when Mom told me goodbye still lingered with me the entire day, though, no matter how hard I tried to focus. I couldn't understand it, and I was unable to shake it off, no matter how hard I tried. Looking back now, I should have told my teacher what was happening. Maybe she might have been able to help to do something, like call my mom and check in on her for me. Oh, that idea left my mind as quickly as it came, drowned out by the instinct to survive the usual teases and taunts of my adversaries. Once the final bell rang to leave, I waited at the front entrance for Mom. She never came. I waited for an hour before my second grade teacher, Mrs. Anderson, saw me shivering like a leaf out in the rain. Mrs. Anderson offered me a ride home and even walked me up to our apartment to make sure I made it there safely. When we arrived, Mrs. Anderson knocked on the front door and we patiently waited for my mom to answer. There was no response. Mrs. Anderson tried again. Still nothing. I was confused. Mom was always the first person to answer the door. My teacher and I looked at each other before she took me to my neighbors, where I waited while they directed her to the landlord. I remember hugging the door frame and peeking out as they returned. The landlord led Mrs. Anderson back to the apartment with a spare key in hand and unlocked the door for her. Opening it, he allowed Mrs. Anderson in the house first before following himself. They called for my mom and listened for an answer, but there wasn't any. There was none. Not even 1 minute after they went in, I heard a random door open, followed by my teacher's horrified scream. Instinctively, I darted to the front door to ask what was going on. All I saw when I ran to the front door was my living room with an open window as the landlord rushed around the hallway corner, picked me up under my arms, and rushed me back to the neighbors with lightning speed. Mrs. Anderson followed close behind us, her hand cupped over her mouth, sobbing hysterically. We stayed with my neighbors until the police arrived with an ambulance. They found my mom in the bathtub. I never really learned of details of her suicide until much later in life, but she apparently bled out in the tub. The running water overflowed into the hallway where Mrs. Anderson found her. What was considered unusual to the coroners was that it was not just her wrists that were slit, but the cuts were all over her body, and there appeared to be no evidence of a suicide note. Even stranger, she was still fully clothed in the tub. With this suspicious evidence, the authorities did consider the idea of an intruder due to the level of violence. There seemed to have been multiple weapons used, as our knife block was empty, and the knives were nowhere to be found. Apart from an open window in the living room, there was no evidence of a second person being in the apartment. No footprints or fingerprints, either on the window or anywhere else. Nothing was missing or damaged apart from the bathroom, which looked like a wrecking ball went through it. The authorities could only suspect that my mom had some sort of mental breakdown, a really severe one. They assumed that the stress of the divorce, coupled with the idea of being a single mother with no job experience, got the better of her, and she took all of her anger out on the bathroom and, of course, herself. Proof of that could be found in a broken wooden frame containing our family photo of us at Disneyland, which lay shattered on the formerly pristine white tile next to the overflowing bathtub. All of the adults felt so sorry for me. Of course, at the time, everyone lied to me and claimed that she just slipped on water and hit her head on the bathroom floor really, really hard. A lie that, even at the age of 7, I would never buy. Like at the neighbors, I waited at the police station with Mrs. Anderson talking to the nice policeman while having the occasional snack and soda until Dad came. The adults all fawned over me, asking if I was okay and if I needed anything else. Of course, my usual answer was no, followed by, "Where's my mom?" Obviously, they never answered me directly. Their usual answer was, "Oh, she's in the hospital right now. She fell down. We're just seeing if she's okay. Your dad is coming to pick you up soon." Eventually, Dad came, and after an hour-long discussion with police, it was time to go. We drove to Dad's new apartment, which was only a few blocks down from our old one. The entire time, he talked about how sorry he was about what happened to Mom and promised me things would get better for us. He also explained how we would probably move out of our small town, hopefully within a few months, depending on whether or not he got his promotion at the office, an opportunity he had been working hard for months on before all of this shit hit the fan. Dad was always a workaholic, one of the driving forces as to why the marriage started struggling. Back then, I thought my father was just being an asshole for not telling me what really happened that day. But now, looking back, I think that that was his way of trying to distract me or even cheer me up. Like any parent, he was trying to preserve my innocence and avoid the gory details of death because, being so young, the only loss I ever experienced was my goldfish when I was 4. Unfortunately, his efforts proved fruitless. However, as I spent the entire drive just staring out the passenger window, staring out the window as the old-looking brick buildings waved us by, thinking of Mom and how she could just leave us, and asking myself if it was my fault she left. I know Dad was secretly thinking about Mom too, because I heard him crying for her in his bedroom later that same night. And all I could do was lay in my sleeping bag on the floor of my new bedroom in our new, much smaller apartment, holding back my own tears. Weeks passed as Dad struggled with Mom's untimely passing, combined with her funeral expenses, his job, and the merciless struggle of paying bills while trying to save money without losing our current establishment. There was also the concern of what will happen with Mom's belongings, some of which fell into our possession, and the stuff that carried no sentimental value Dad sold to cover a few of the bills, including Mom's 1981 Datsun. Eventually, Dad had just enough money to stay afloat, but was still treading on some thin ice. So we had to still cut back on many expenses. No more junk food and candy, but home-cooked meals from a can or whatever goods were packed in the paper bags Dad brought home from the local food locker. Dad constantly had to go to work, taking double shifts and staying overtime. And as for me, I had to study. My father grew up in a very strict household. His father, my grandfather, was a merchant mariner in his youth and was very firm when it came to discipline. Grandpa would beat Dad senseless with a belt if he ever got bad grades at my age. So Dad was a hair stricter about GPA and responsibility than Mom. Only he just yell at me at the top of his lungs, as he didn't like hitting me unless I really fucked up. So when he heard of my current GPA, he immediately set up a new schedule for me, including times like when I would study, what I would study, and how long I would study it for. He even signed me up for extracurricular activities to take every other weekend to prevent boredom and cause trouble. Not that I would be distracted during my studies either way. Dad locked all my toys in his bedroom closet to make sure I wasn't distracted during my studies. Dad said I could get them back when I got my grades back up, and he gave me till the end of the school year to do so. I didn't have any time, so in short, I didn't have any time to myself to play, watch TV, or do anything a regular kid my generation would do. Nor did I have the time to really mourn over my mother's death. In hindsight, Dad was not really doing it as a punishment, more of a way to keep me busy. Like his way of keeping my mind off of all of the chaos that was going on. I had to be the strong one. I had to help set the example. A month passed by before I saw the creature again. The night I did, it was a Sunday. I went to bed at my new set time, 9 p.m. But because I was still somewhat used to my usual time to go to bed, which was any time of night, after spending half of it reading comic books under the covers and eating candy, I snuck from the kitchen. I remained awake. It was around 12:30 a.m. when I finally started drifting off. This time, I was living in the third story, so instead of some unusual feeling in the pit of my stomach, I woke to something bouncing off my bedroom window. I craned my neck and observed the window beside my headboard. A second later, a pebble ricocheted off the glass. Curious, I got out of bed and faced the window. Standing tall on the ground was the creature waiting patiently. With a smile, I unlocked the window. I was about to open it when I saw something was wrong with the frame. Embedded in the wooden plank below the glass was a large crack, constituting from the bottom left corner, then curving upward and stretching along the glass lining until it stopped just a few inches from the other end. So it seemed like this piece of wood was just about to break off at any moment. So, with a struggle, I managed to open the window while keeping the heavy frame straight and not breaking off this extra piece of wood as it squeaked. The first thing I was greeted with was that same putrid scent, stronger than before. Out of politeness, I stomached the odor as best I could and quietly greeted the beast. I was able to get a better look at its overall appearance, but the shadow of the building cast on our side at night, so it was still too dark for me to see every detail, but at least there was no more rain. From what I could tell, he appeared to be what I assumed, a giant stuffed animal. However, judging by his outline highlighted by the streetlights, he was poorly sewn together from other parts of various other stuffed animals, with tufts of fur on some parts of his body, while others seemed to be left bare. Its fur seemed to be different colors and lengths, some long and shaggy, others short and prickly. Though he was clearly an animal of some sort, he behaved somewhat like a cartoon character. He gazed up at me, wagging his tail side to side like a dog, each time it smacked the pavement. His tail was thick and somewhat stiff. It reminded me of a classic dinosaur tale illustrated in storybooks. He waved merrily to me. I waved back. Then he sneezed. A strand of mucus conjectured from his nose and launched two white puffs of air, which dissipated into the atmosphere. Faltering only for a second, the beast caught himself and wiped the dangling mucus from his nose with his left arm. Then, when he pulled his arm away, however, the one strand became three. Two thin webs of mucus stretched with his arm, while the third dangled loosely from his nostrils. His actions reminded me that of a cartoon character, as his movements were very exaggerated. What I was hoping for next was that the two strands of snot would freeze instantly and break into dust like they were dipped into liquid nitrogen. I chuckled. The monster chuckled with me, wiping the last of the mucus from his muzzle. And it was at that very moment I knew this creature would become my best friend. Someone I could talk to and share my innermost thoughts with. Someone who would help me through the worst time in my life. A friendship, like any stupid kid, I assumed would last forever. I was about to ask his name when a loud thud occurred from behind me, and a thunderous roar broke through the silence. "Luke!" I wheeled around and saw my dad standing at the doorway. I backed myself up against the window frame as he charged. I knew I fucked up when Dad grabbed me by the arm with one hand and smacked the back of my head with the other. Then Dad pushed me on the bed and... Wait. Dad then pushed me on the bed as he stuck his head out the window, scanning the ground below. Like the Terminator, the creature must have run off because after a couple seconds, he forcefully slammed the window shut, locked it, and glared back at me. Who the hell were you talking to? Nobody, Dad, I squeaked, pulling at my shirt nervously, fearing another hit. Who was outside the fucking window, Lucas? Tell me now, he demanded. Nobody, Dad, I swear. I cried and vouched for my innocence as Dad towered over me ominously. Then he raised a finger an inch from my nose and said, I'll be checking your room every hour until midnight from now on. It is impossible to get anything by me. And if I catch you again, not only will I be beating some pervert to death, you're not going to know what the word play means ever again. Dad growled cynically before storming out of the room, slamming the bedroom door behind him. I listened as Dad shouted and swore all the way back to his room. Then silence. I took a deep breath, crawled back into bed, and faced the wall, whimpering like a 4-year-old girl. An hour passed before I heard another sound at the window once more. Not a ping this time, but more like a tap, tap. Looking back at the window, I saw a folded up piece of paper wedged in the crack of the wood. I waited about a minute before getting up to retrieve the treasure. I was about to unfold it when I began to wonder, how did he get up here? I opened the window one last time and stuck my head outside. There was no fire escape on our side of the building, and nothing to grab onto other than a few thin pipes running down the walls to the ground, where dumpsters and trash cans rested, littered with discarded beer cans and bags of waste carelessly tossed to the ground. I examined the wall around my window frame and found large muddy paw prints and slight scratches on the old clay bricks, which surprised me because that thing had pretty long claws. Judging by the evidence, he seemed to crawl up the wall like Spider-Man. The evidence wasn't staying long as yet another storm came in, wiping away the paw prints like an eraser on a chalkboard. I turned my attention to the dirt field beyond the fence by my house. There, I saw the faintest outline of oddly shaped footprints embedded in the muddy grass, leading from my apartment, to the construction site about 200 yards away. I closed the window for the last time. Sliding back into bed, I unfolded the sheet of paper. It was a note. I had trouble reading it because of the sloppy handwriting. It was like a kid who was not much older than me had written it. But I managed to, and on the notes were the words, Hello, Luke. My name is Otto the bear. Would you like to be my friend? Below the sentence were 2 boxes, one for yes, the other for no. Excited, I searched frantically but quietly for a pen or pencil. I finally found one from my desk drawer and checked yes. Then I went back to the window and slipped the note into the crack before hopping back into bed for the last time. I could feel every fiber of my being bursting with excitement, my mind racing in a million different directions at once. One by one, a list of questions raced through my skull. Will he read my answer? What will he say? Will he come back? When will he come back? All of those ideas, of course, came with the inevitable question. What if Dad finds out? I finally fell asleep around 2 a.m. My alarm went off at 7 a.m. Okay. Chapter 2. See you. Luke. I woke to my father standing at the doorway, fiddling with his tie. Get up. It's time for school, he ordered, still agitated about last night. Then, as soon as he came, Dad turned and left. Groggy, I shifted Groggy, I shuffled to the closet, picking out a random green sweater and some blue jeans. I was mostly dressed when I felt the slightest puff of wind kiss my shoulder. There, in the window, was what I presumed was a new note from Otto. I plucked the paper out of the crack, and just as I heard Dad's footsteps returning, so I hid the note in my underwear. He entered the room fully dressed in his office suit and asked, "Why aren't you dressed yet?" As I fumbled for an answer, Dad glanced up at the window. "Huh, there's a crack in the frame. Is that why you opened the window last night?" I froze, turning to the window, and I remembered the crack, and then I turned around and stared back at him with a stupid look on my face. Yeah, I felt cold," I replied. "So I went to check the window. And not to worry, I'll fix it myself over the weekend. Just don't mess with the window. You could hurt yourself," Dad explained forgivingly. I could tell he then had severe regret for last night. "Now hurry up and get dressed. You're going to be late." Dad left the room and went to the kitchen. I turned back at the jagged, narrow rift, concerned about losing my only line of communication with my new friend. Reluctantly, I got dressed, ate breakfast with Dad, and went to school. Word of my mom's suicide spread like wildfire amongst my old neighbor's building, which reached the ears of the children who lived there, many of which were students at my elementary school. Then, after returning from a short period of absence, Mrs. Anderson unintentionally added fuel to the fire when she decided to talk about her experience with fellow staff members. This action eventually reached the ears of the other teachers, then the parents of the This action eventually reached the ears of the other teachers, then the parents of students living outside the complex, and then their kids, who in turn changed much of the rumor into a mythology. Whenever I would walk down the hallway, I could feel the other students' stares drilling into me and could hear the insensitive whispers. "Is that him? Hey, there's the kid whose mom went crazy and killed herself." Teachers pitied me and would often try to get me to talk to them at recess or after school. Sometimes I would talk to them because it made me feel better knowing that some people were willing to listen to my side of the situation. However, I never once brought up the creature, Otto. Something told me that they wouldn't believe me either. They'd probably think I'd gone crazy, or I was making it up to gain more sympathy. The school nurses saw me often. Not all kids simply talked about me. Some harassed me, taunted me, shoved me to the ground, injured me almost on a daily basis, especially my biggest bully, Barry. Though it had been going on as long as I could remember, it seemed to have gotten worse after Mom's death. But this day would go a little different than usual. When I arrived at school, I set my backpack on one of the many hooks by the door and went to my desk at the second to last row of the classroom. That day, the neighboring student was out sick, so I got a perfect view of the playground outside. Mrs. Anderson took roll, then quickly began the class by going over the lesson plan for the day, pointing at each subject written on the whiteboard. After the introduction, Mrs. Anderson followed with a lecture on English. Still slightly fatigued, I casually looked out the window, my eyes glazing over the multicolored playground, observing the swing set sway in the polar breeze as water droplets fall off the yellow monkey bars, and a ghostly white fog glided over the soggy, shadowy blacktop. That's when I saw Otto again, standing in the middle of the playground beside the red corkscrew slide as a large, ominous silhouette in the milky white mist. I rubbed my eyes and looked back. And sure enough, there he was. still standing there, watching me. He waved to me. Instinctively, I waved back with a pencil in hand. My actions did not go unnoticed. Lucas, who are you waving at? Mrs. Anderson called. I looked back to find her and the rest of the class staring back at me as if I was patient zero for a new deadly contagion. I wasn't waving at anything, Mrs. Anderson, I answered, tugging at my shirt under the desk. A few kids giggled at my pitiful reply as Mrs. Anderson grew more suspicious of me. Who were you waving at, Lucas? She asked again, her voice firmer than before. I wasn't doing anything, Mrs. Anderson. I insisted, but not convincingly enough, however, as she walked over to my desk while not taking her eyes off me. She stopped beside me and looked out the window. The other kids did the same. There was nothing outside but an empty playground and the gloom drifting over the blacktop, masking the fence and the street beyond. After easing her suspicions, Mrs. Anderson returned to the front of the room, and class went back to normal for the rest of the morning until recess. Like all the other kids, I rushed outside, not to play or socialize, but hoping to find Otto waiting for me somewhere, only to be stopped dead in my tracks by the campus security guard. Sorry, kid, not this time, the security guard said, turning me around. Inside, it's going to rain in a few minutes. The guards, coupled with a few teachers and staff, proceeded to round up the other students and guide them back to their classrooms. I begged to the authority figure, "Wait, sir! I wanted to see my friend. He's expecting me." It was then a droplet of water bounced off my nose. "No, you have to go inside. You can talk to your friend later," he replied firmly. I joined some of my fellow peers in their whining all the way back to the building. A few seconds before Mrs. Anderson finished gathering the last of her students, I happened to catch a glimpse of something rush behind the playground. A stiff, patchy tail and part of a back. No one else saw it, being too wrapped up in the commotion in the halls. I remained fixated on the playground, standing in the middle of the corridor like an idiot. "Lucas!" Mrs. Anderson called. "What are you doing?" I looked back to the other students, all lined up in two nearly perfect alphabetical rows. Some glanced at one another and giggled while Mrs. Anderson remained focused on me, slightly irked. Sorry, Mrs. Anderson." I hastily took my place in line. That was all and I saw nothing else while we were being herded into the classroom. It wasn't even another 5 minutes before the rain began pouring down again. I spent that whole recess looking out the window, hoping to see Otto again. There was no sign of him, only the campus security patrolling the blacktop like watchdogs. Class went back in session, and I spent the bulk of it staring at the whiteboard while painstakingly copying down whatever Mrs. Anderson wrote into my notebook. Eventually, she moved on to spelling, a subject which I've known ever since I could remember, and so my interest trailed off again. To satisfy my boredom and pass the time, I watched the other kids pass notes to one another, chuckling about what they wrote. On occasion, they'd whisper their subjects to each other quietly so that Mrs. Anderson couldn't hear. For a while, I didn't really know what they were discussing until the teacher turned around to face the board once again. And then a blonde-haired, brown-eyed boy in the second row from the front, named Barry, glanced back at me. A menacing grin grew across his face, unveiling his perfect pearly white teeth held in place by gold-colored braces. Ever since kindergarten. He was my first and primary bully at school, so I wasn't really surprised that he was spreading rumors about me, most likely rumors about my mother and her suicide. It was so often that everyone gave him the not so original name, Barry the Bully. As negative as it sounds, Barry was the complete opposite in terms of reputation. He was popular, only because his parents were very well off, despite being divorced. Both parents never believed in each other's stands on what trends were good for him and secretly bought him whatever he wanted. I remember overhearing him boasting about that at recess one day. Through his subservient father, Barry got the best Pokemon cards, Game Boy systems, and toys, earning him the most friends. Though his ignorant mother, uh, though his ignorant mother, Barry had through his ignorant mother, Barry had the best clothes and backpacks. And through the both of them, Barry never got in trouble at school. No matter how many accusations piled up against him, he never got in trouble. As achieving everything a spoiled brat could ever want wasn't enough, it was so convenient for him to convince the other kids to pick on me. He even developed a system where he'd have certain kids harass me for foiled Pokemon cards or small toys so he wouldn't get into trouble as much or as often. This month came the new hobby, harassing me about my mother's death. I watched stoically as he exchanged looks with his friend, a dark-haired boy named Billy, Barry's partner in crime. Both friends chuckled to each other before continuing with their subtle chat line. Alienated from the rest of the class, I continued glancing out the window, searching for Otto. That's when I remembered the note he'd left me. I still had it in my underwear. Being careful not to draw any more attention to myself, I gradually retrieved the note and placed it under my notebook. I looked around the room to make sure my fellow peers, who thankfully were too busy amongst themselves to care, were watching. Knowing that I was safe, I picked up the note and unfolded it gently. Written on the piece of paper was one simple phrase: "See you at school, Luke." I was confused at first, but quickly understood what he meant. See you at school. See you. As far as I know, Otto has been watching me all morning. The winter shower finally let up in time for lunch so students could go outside and play. That's when I saw him most. When I first saw him again, I was playing Foursquare with some of the other kids who didn't look very thrilled about me being there. I was that type of shy kid who'd still attempt to interact with other kids to a certain extent. At first, they seemed to be okay with me being around until a new kid, usually someone they knew, joined in. Then, as quickly as I was noticed, I'd be forgotten. Left in the rain to watch the reunited group of friendships skip off into the sunset. Though I don't think that was the case here. I'm pretty sure the reason these three kids in particular were playing with me was because their teacher told them to. And judging by the disappointed looks on their faces, that was the truth. The girl adjacent to me bounced the ball my way. I was going to hit it to the kid across from me when I happened to see something standing about 30 yards past him, behind all the other kids in the playground. It was Otto, hiding in the shadows of the indoor hallway facing me. The experience was so weird that it felt like it would happen in slow motion. Children ran by, laughing and yelling in the foreground as I stared into where his eyes were. I felt as if I was in some sort of trance. My body suddenly felt tired as my gaze continued to zero in on Otto's frame. "Why are you staring at me?" I snapped from my trance and was met by the angry face of the kid in front of me. I forgot he was even there. "Oh, sorry, I thought I saw something behind you." My explanation seemed to do nothing but make him more agitated. He and the girl next to him casually glanced behind them. Seeing nothing, they quickly snapped back at me accusingly. "Liar!" I could do nothing but absorb the angry looks of the other players, along with the awkward silence. The kid next to me sighed. Just throw the ball, the, the boy in front of me yelled. The girl rolled her eyes and exchanged looks with the other boy beside me, who appeared equally as irritated. Sorry, I sighed, hitting the red rubber ball over. I continued to play Foursquare for about another 5 minutes before abandoning it to play on the playground. It was clear the other players didn't want me there, so why bother staying? I decided to accomplish an old school tradition created by the fifth graders: to climb the top of the monkey bars and look out at the campus. A challenge that many students achieved before being brought into either the principal or nurse's office. I wasn't that much of a daredevil. It took a lot of mental persuasions for me to start climbing to the top, and I considered giving up until a few other kids encouraged me, some wanting to see me do the impossible. Others wanted to see if I'd fall. I remember hearing Barry the bully's voice amongst the small crowd of kids, calling me a weenie. Instead of feeling discouraged, I made myself follow through with my goal, just to prove Barry's stupid ass wrong for once. I finally accomplished my goal just 5 minutes before the bell rang for class. I stood up, carefully balancing both feet on the wet metal bars. After setting up a strong foothold atop the foundation, I observed all the kids on the blacktop and could even see into some of the windows of the classrooms in the school. As I scanned the environment, I happened to catch movement inside the music room, lying just parallel to the monkey bars. In the left wing of the all the way over at the left wing of the campus. It was Otto again. I could barely see him because the wing was clear across the playground, but I did see the outline of his head, shoulders, and tail. He was rummaging vigorously through the music room, searching for something, stopping only for a brief second to look at me. Foggy condensation grew and died on the glass as he breathed. The classroom door behind him was missing. Once again, I fell into some sort of trance. This took place for a minute until he suddenly wheeled around to face something behind him. I stood puzzled, my feet atop the monkey bars, my head leaned to the side like a clueless cartoon character. "Hey, what are you doing up there?" An adult voice echoed from the cacophony of children's laughter. I broke my sight from the window to see a campus security guard beckoning at me. "Get down now," she ordered. I prepared myself for descent, stopping only for a brief second to re-observe the band room once more. Otto was still there, facing away from me, tearing angrily at something in front of him. For a second, I thought I saw what I could only describe at the time as red paint spraying in the room, with some tiny droplets staining the glass. I leaned to my right to see if I could get a better view of the interior scene when the security guard yelled again, "Hey, didn't you hear me? Get down from there!" Just then, my foot slipped from between the bars and I fell through, hitting my crotch and ribs on the bars before falling backward and landing onto the cold concrete underneath with a cold, wet smack. Chapter 3: Introductions. I regained consciousness in the nurse's office, my head pounding. Apparently, when I had fallen, I landed head first. The nurse gave me an ice pack, and I waited for Dad to arrive shortly after. As a precaution, Dad took me to the doctor, who informed him that I had a slight concussion, but I should be fine. However, he recommended that I stay home for a day or two, just to be safe. Knowing my dad, it was going to be 3 days, which was awesome. That meant a 3-day vacation from school, and with my father's permission, it also meant I could actually play for the first time in over a month. Dad may have been shrewd when it came to downright demanding at times, but when he gave you a break, he was very generous with it. Dad drove me home and put me in bed. He gave me an ice pack, made me macaroni and cheese, and wheeled a spare TV into my room. He even went as far as to unlock his closet and give some of my toys back, including Bo. Once I was all set up, Dad left me to watch some cartoons for the rest of the day. Well, it wasn't until around 7 p.m. when Dad came back into my room and sat at the foot of my bed. He put his hand on my leg ever so tenderly and asked, "Son, what were you doing? What were you thinking doing something so dangerous? You're old enough to know better." Sorry, Dad, it was an accident. I thought. Then out of the blue, the phone rang. Dad paused as the device sounded through the house for a second time, before heading into the kitchen to answer it, picking it up on the third ring. I couldn't be sure, but I knew it was Mrs. Anderson on the other end. Probably telling him about my unusual behavior today. Mrs. Anderson was always the type of teacher to do that. If you were slacking off or disrupting her class, she usually made sure your parents knew about it. The fact that Mom didn't know about my slipping grades until the progress report was perhaps a splash of good luck in a sea of misfortune. I remained in bed and anticipated on what was probably going to happen next. Like maybe when Dad hung up, he would storm back into my bedroom furious and strip away my only chance for relaxation. Yell at me and have me spend my 3-day vacation doing chores around the house. After exchanging a few more words, Dad hung up the phone and entered the room again. Not furious, just irritated. "Lucas, that was Mrs. Anderson on the other line. What was so important for you to be hanging your head out the window instead of doing your schoolwork?" he asked sternly. With a sigh, I confessed. "Okay, Dad." I told him about Otto and how I saw him at school. I even told Dad how I saw Otto the night before Mom died. Surprisingly, Dad didn't yell at me, nor did he ground me for lying. Granted, he was definitely flustered at first, but by the end of my explanation, his expression shifted to concern. Like a typical logical parent, he dismissed all of it, telling me that monsters aren't real and what I was seeing was in my mind and blah, blah, blah. It took another 20 minutes of Dad's ranting advice for me to realize that he was never going to believe me, and no one else will either. I was angry at first, but after some thought, I accepted it as a good thing. It meant that I didn't have to worry about Dad, or anyone else for that matter, ever finding out about Otto. Because, well, they perceive my bear to be imaginary. That was my advantage. That was our advantage. You know what they say, ignorance is bliss. The only other problem was how to keep people from finding out. After another 20 minutes or so, Dad finally stopped lecturing me and quietly stepped out of the room, shaking his head in disappointment and leaving me to my imagination. I pondered over that very thought of how to keep my secret until I fell asleep. Later that night, around 1:30 a.m., a new thunderstorm blew in, and it was pouring rain yet again. I awoke to a tap-tap on my window. A huge smile spread across my face as I cast the covers off my body gleefully, knocking Bo to the floor. I jumped out of bed before the window, and a new note lodged in the crack. I plucked it out before the rain could distort the writing and unfolded it. Luke, don't be alarmed when I write this, but I have been watching you for a while, and I want to finally meet you in person. Meet me at the construction site by your house at your house by 2 a.m. Oh, remember to leave your window unlocked. I wondered why he would ask me about leaving my window unlocked, and I fear the consequences of what would happen if Dad caught me outside at that time of night. And I knew that streets and wooded areas, especially in this weather, can be very dangerous, even at that age. But my eagerness to finally meet my new friend in person overrode any rational thought I had. Come on, it'd be like meeting your favorite cartoon character in person, my inner self argued. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. With that concept in mind, I turned my sights to the establishment. I dug out my small yellow flashlight from my bottom dresser drawer, adorned my blue snow jacket and yellow rain boots. Then I opened my bedroom door as quietly as I could and placed one foot out onto the hallway. I poked my head out into the darkness, scanning the corridor before seeing my father's bedroom door left ajar in the room adjacent to mine. The light from his TV set flickered around the edges of the wooden barrier, with the volume turned up loud. I snuck into the hallway. Then, with as much caution as I could muster, I peeked into Dad's room. Luckily, I didn't have to worry about Dad waking up anytime soon. He was in bed, fast asleep, provided by a 6-pack of beer and half a bag of weed. He rolled over, facing away from me, exposing the large, detailed dragon tattoo he sported on his left shoulder. With a sense of satisfaction, I pressed onward between the living room and kitchen to the front door, unlocking it slowly. Opening it as silently as I could, I peeked into the shadows of the corridor beyond. The coast was clear. There were no lights or any other indications that our neighbors were awake, meaning that with any luck, I didn't have to worry about getting in trouble for the next several hours. I made my way to the elevator down the hall and pressed the button for the first floor. I exited the elevator and stepped into the front entrance where I was greeted by closed glass doors, presumably locked. Staring at the invisible barrier standing between me and the outside, I considered admitting defeat and heading back up. That is until I noticed the posters on the bulletin board fluttered and the fingertips in my right hand went numb from an at first unnoticeable cold air. I aimed my flashlight back to the front entrance as the door swung ajar, allowing a burst of chilling night air to flood into the lobby. A flash of lightning, followed by a crack of thunder, exploded from the outside. Otto must have unlocked it somehow, I thought. He must really be expecting me. The night was almost pitch black, the only things lighting my way being a toy flashlight with a few lampposts lining the sidewalk and the occasional explosion of lightning. Scanning the scenery, I could see the tall 20th century buildings towering over the quiet, nearly lifeless roads. I marched my way to the chain-linked fence next to the complex. Beyond the fence was a giant soggy grass field, and beyond that was the new construction site, perpetuating halfway between the ground and the sky, adorned by a veil of black clouds looming overhead. I didn't know if I could make the trek, but I remained determined to see Otto. Maneuvering my way around the fence, I started down the muddy terrain. fighting against the syrupy earth as blasts of frigid wind and the raw, frosty sting of raindrops stung at my face as I inched my way through. My rain boots became more and more caked with mud and grass, with each step I took making it harder and harder to walk. A third of the way down the path, the chilly weather combated with my exhaustion made me think of the warmth and safety of my own bed. Halfway down the path, I was expecting to hear my father's earful call rip through the foreboding atmosphere like a black and white monster movie. However, nothing dared to interrupt the rhythm of raindrops, thunder, and scrunching sounds of my footsteps in the muddy gloom. 3/4 of the way there, my excitement began to warm me like a campfire as I lifted my flashlight to observe the sight. As I got closer, the section proceeded to grow in size until it touched the sky above me like a monument. I finally reached the barbed wire fence surrounding the location. The skeleton of the building was still 70% exposed, with freshly added cement on the first floor being the exception. Temporarily growing with it were the first wooden levels and metal bars construction workers used to walk on as they build. There were no signs indicating exactly what the building was going to be, but the sheer size of the architecture suggested an upcoming apartment or company. It was standing in what would be I was standing in what would be the side entrance of the building, and I walked alongside the fence until I found a large hole torn between the wiring and one of the poles, spacious enough for a sizable animal to fit through, like Otto. I was puzzled about how a hole this big could be missed by any person, but didn't stop to think twice. The entrance was covered in wet cement. Okay. I walked through the tailored opening and onward into what I assume was the side entrance. The entrance was covered in wet cement and adored with white tarps. Bobcat cranes and bulldozers surrounded the perimeter like guard dogs resting outside their master's mansion. I went up to it and found a small hole ripped into it, the same size as the hole in the fence. Only this one appeared to be cut through by claws in one swift swipe. With my flashlight leading the way, I entered the building into a big, dark, empty room. Maneuvering around piles of piping, wood, and whipping ribbons of plastic, I made my way to the very center of the site. Much of the constructed dwelling was still framework, with the top still exposed to the elements. Rain spilled from exposed areas at the top of the architecture, forming small waterfalls on the plastic sheets and forming small lakes onto the new concrete floor. I waited in the middle of the compound when a shadow rushed across the tarp, circling the room in front of me. I kept my eyesight fixated on the area for more signs of life. Then the tarp beside me rustled unexpectedly. I turned and froze, my flashlight channeled into the black veil, but failing to penetrate through it. Then I heard something behind me. I turned around and anticipated something from my worst nightmare, but thankfully there wasn't anything. But I was still very nervous. I looked around the seemingly empty room in front of me, where I heard the grunt of a large predator hiding in the shadows. I was paralyzed. Then the smell returned, thicker, stronger, heavier. I coughed and gagged as a putrid scent surrounded me. As sick as I initially felt, I remained where I was and continued to watch the entryway ahead. Then I began to see movement in the shadows. The creature let out 2 deep grunts before boldly stepping out on all fours from the mouth of the dark room. I took a step back and watched as the beast gradually revealed itself. Its head was reminiscent of a grizzly bear's, big and dark brown, but its snout was stubby with a giant black nose at the end. Though it bore similar rings around its eyes like a grizzly, they were a dark gray and weren't the only markings on its face. A huge gray patch of fur began from the top of its snout and extended up the bridge of its nose through up to its forehead, dividing into a T shape, which ended on the sides of its face around its shaggy cheeks, giving the expression of mutton chops. There were even tufts of gray fur at the tips of his small, bushy ears, like snow on a mountain. He had no eyes, only empty sockets, as if someone scooped them out. His large mouth was stitched shut with long, single strands of fishing wire, and a small beard sagged from his chin. The bare head was stitched to a massive body, his shoulders being a combination of different colored animal furs. I assumed were from completely different animal species, with a mighty hump between its shoulder blades, again like a grizzly. Then the arms came into view. He had the arms of what I could only guess was a giant stuffed polar bear plushie. They were so big and thick that it would have been any kid's dream to have as a whole animal. At the end of his paws were 3-foot-long metal claws lined with rusted copper, attached to 5 round digits and hanging by screw hinges that drilled through his paws. The screws seemed to be drilled right through the creature's fingers, and each time the beast took a step, its claws would let out a shing like Freddy Krueger's razor fingers. Though his forelimbs matched, the beast's hind limbs did not. His right leg had a gigantic but average-looking bare leg with only a few blue-striped fabric patches around the knee. His left leg was made of 3 animal furs, ending with a black gorilla foot. The creature's back, from what I could tell, was also composed of different furs and one big fabric sheet. Sauntering behind the monster was its tail, which was a long, starting thick at the base and then gradually tapering to become thinner and thinner at the tip. Its tail behaved similar to a classic cartoon dinosaur tail, stiff yet serpentine. Yet it was bare with almost no fur like a rat's. It looked to be made of mostly leather with some mammal hide cleaved together in large patches. The bear stood upright, revealing his big brown belly, also mildly patched up, with a large seam running down the center, like most stuffed teddy bears. His right shoulder was covered with a huge piece of black fur, while his left was covered with denim, with an actual zipper over where his heart was located. Like Frankenstein's monster, he was covered in stitches and staples, carrying an eerie scent of wet dog. Yet he displayed the comedic design of and cartoonish mannerisms of a comical Tim Burton character. The beast gazed down at me with his empty yet expressive eye sockets. Upon seeing him in full form, I learned my previous estimate of his height was wrong. I thought he was 10 feet tall. He actually seemed closer to around 13 feet. I remained still, surprised to finally see him, but frightened about what he looked like and how big and intimidating he actually was. Though he had no eyes, it was like he could still see me, plain as day. We remained deadlocked in a staring contest for what felt like an eternity. Until, with all the courage I could muster, I finally asked him with the softest, most hushed voice I never knew I could make. Uh, Otto, is that you? The monster bear smirked silently and nodded. I inched closer to him. Hi, Otto. My name is Luke. The beast did nothing but kept his mouth shut and smiled. Then he slowly extended his right hand in front of me. His claws mechanically unfolded one by one, exposing his muddy, padded palm. At first, I was confused by this gesture. Then, analyzing Otto as he stood before me, his hand at my chest level, it took a moment for me to realize and for me to finally understand. Looking up to him, I slowly but steadily grasped his paw in my hands and the reins and shook his hand. I slowly but steadily grasped his paw and we shook hands. Then the rain stopped. Both of us looked up to the sky as the clouds cleared, unveiling the stars. Otto and I looked at each other with big, closed smiles. We spent the rest of the nights playing at the construction site. Otto taught me how to climb by carrying me to the top of the skeletal monument to show me the gorgeous view of the foothills. At first I was afraid and looked down at the ground, which increased my fear of falling. But Otto held on to me and leveled my head with a claw. I gazed in awe upon the mighty foothills of California. We stayed up there observing the beauty of the landscape before climbing back down. Then Otto had me climb parts of the interior myself. The best way I could describe it was almost like rock climbing, only without the ropes or safety harness. I struggled, but quickly got the hang of it. Now I know what you're thinking. This was stupid and foolish of me to even be up there, especially after a heavy rainstorm. But I didn't think of that. The only thing I knew at the time was that I never felt so alive in my life. I felt my confidence skyrocket into the outer space as I breathed in the air, standing proudly atop the weak wood and cement, almost tempted to climb the rest of the way. Otto was always there to catch me, so I wasn't worried at all. And this may sound cheesy, but I actually felt like I could touch the sky. I felt invincible. I can still hear Otto clapping for me as I stood atop the skeletal entrance. He even let me ride on his back as we ran through our playground. His fur felt as if it was real, but it was surprisingly stiff and prickly. What was even stranger is that he had no body heat. But what was the strangest and creepiest of all was the odor, the same wet dog and old meat scent that I encountered before came in full force, but it wasn't coming from its surface, but rather inside Otto, inside his very body. The unusual sensations I detected left my mind, however, as we played. I pretended he was my Digimon, fully evolved to his mega form. This was around the time Digimon first came out, so I was already a big fan at the time. So, we acted a fight with a non-existent rival Digimon, hell-bent on taking over both the digital and human world. We'd even improvise attacks. Since Otto couldn't talk, I had to order him around like a Pokemon. Ottomon, Huntsman Spear, I ordered. Otto raced past me to the random cement post I pointed at. Then, at the last second, the bear slid his feet, picked up a huge metal pipe, and hurled it at the pillar like a spear. Bullseye! Right through the middle of the post. He threw the pipe so hard that it actually pierced through the still moist cement, one end of the pipe facing us, the other penetrating through the other side of the pillar. The pillar itself was dented. I looked up in awe at Otto, and he looked back at me with a big closed smile across his face. We continued to play around in the construction site, rolling in the mud and climbing a few more areas to top off the night. We climbed back to the top of the site to watch cars roll down the foothills. And just before the sun was about to rise, I finally worked up the courage to ask, Otto, how can you see me? How do you know I'm even here? Otto chuckled and flicked up a long, pointy claw and tapped his nose. You can smell me? Otto nodded with that. Then, with that same claw, pointed to his ear. It took me a minute, but I finally understood what he was trying to say. Hearing? I paused. You can smell and hear me? Otto nodded. Wow, that's cool! I exploded with amazement. The cheery bear chuckled again. After about 10 more minutes, we climbed back down. Otto volunteered to take me home on his back. Halfway down the trail home, I looked down at my clothes and realized how filthy they were. My jacket and pants were spotted with mud, and my boots were practically solidified in cocoons of dirt and dead grass. Oh no! Otto stopped and glanced up at me. I can't go inside like this. I'll get in trouble. I gestured to my clothes. Otto didn't react the same way I did. Only raised a brow, then proceeded walking perfectly calm while I continued to panic. Otto, stop! I can't go inside like this. I need to get clean. Still, the bear pressed on. I sobbed, fearing the punishment that would await me when I got home. Assuming Dad wasn't already awake, and assuming Dad wasn't already awake, and I could sneak in without stirring him, he'd still noticed the muddy line of children's footprints leading to my bedroom on his way to the kitchen. No matter what idea I could think of, there was still no way out of it. The end result was going to be the same. Through my teary eyes, I saw Otto remain calm and quiet. He continued to walk me home despite my fears. Otto stopped at the apartment and stood upright. We both looked up to my window and then to each other. I was about to get off when Otto reached behind himself and held me in place. Then, without much warning, the giant monster bear placed his paws on the wall and proceeded to climb it like Spider-Man. I clenched onto his fur as he continued up to my window and opened it for me with little to no effort at all. He lowered his head and gesture for me to go inside. I hesitated, but did just what he asked. I crawled in as carefully as I could over the beast's shoulders and head into the window frame and slid into the window. Once I was in my room, I looked back at him. The bear reached into the right part of his stomach. Stitched to it was a dark blue denim patch with a buttoned pocket. Otto unbuttoned the pocket and pulled out a note, handing it to me before climbing down. I hung my head out the window and watched as Otto turned and started back around the fence. But he didn't return to the construction site. Instead, he galloped to the closest wooded area next to the field. I waved back to him as he went. Then I closed the window and hastily removed my muddy clothes, tossing them in a suitable hiding space in the very back of the closet. I then remembered the front door was left unlocked. I quickly left my bedroom, and thankfully Dad was still asleep as I slipped through the kitchen and the living room, which was thankfully still empty. I darted for the front door, locked it, and hastily tiptoed back into my room. curling up under the covers, bow in my arms. I unfolded the piece of paper. Same time tomorrow? At the bottom of the phrase were two boxes, one for yes, the other for no. I reached for my pencil and checked yes. Once the deed was done, I stuffed the note into Bo's chest pocket and drifted off into a gentle sleep. I woke up to Dad opening the door. Well, it's about time you woke up, sleepyhead. How'd you sleep? Dad asked merrily. Good. I yawned, rubbing my eyes. I checked my clock and saw that it was well into noon. Okay. Stay in bed today and rest. I'll bring you some lunch. What would you like? Dad asked. Cheeseburger, please. I replied with a smile. Coming right up. Dad strolled to the kitchen. I relaxed and shifted the covers over me when I saw Otto's note in Bo's pocket. I looked at the note and then at Dad, who was facing away, prepping the hamburger patties. I took the opportunity to slide out of bed and hide the note in my desk for later, and I was about to return to bed when I caught the sight of the construction zone it was being added to. I wondered if Otto was really living there, or if he was simply, or if it was simply a type of playground for us to hang out. But I didn't care as I got back into bed and turned on the TV, waiting for brunch. All right, that's going to end the live stream for now. That was the first 3 chapters. I'll do another one on Wednesday morning with chapters. We'll see if I can complete at least chapters 4 through 6 of Otto's Toy Factory. All right, for those watching, thank you and have a good day. And leave me as much feedback as you can in the comments section. I could use some critiquing. Thank you and have a good day. And please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the creepypasta. Oh, part 1. This is the end of Otto's Toy Factory part 1, chapters 1 through 3, and I'll see you Wednesday morning.